Hi guys, welcome to Basement Supercar Build, the channel where we see if an average guy like me can design and build his own mid-engine car. This video will be a highlights video of the work that was finished this week. If you want to see the actual work take place, watch the full-length video for this week. And with that out of the way, let's get started on this week's video.
So I just did an initial leak test on the tanks just to see if I could spot anything before I move further forward. And both tanks have a leak. I filled them full of water, which is not a good idea to put water in your fuel tanks, but since the tops are still off, I can get down inside and wipe them completely dry and clean, so that won't be an issue. But like I said, both tanks have a leak. This one has a pretty good leak, and I see where it's at. When I very first started welding the tanks together, this was the first tack weld that I put on, and the welder wasn't set quite right, and I almost burnt through, or thought I almost burnt through, but I guess I did there in one little spot. You can see I tried to patch it just below the tape, just in case I did burn through, but obviously I didn't get the leak. So that's the only one I see on this tank, and I will see if I can patch that with welding. If not, I'll go back in with some like tank sealer. It's like an epoxy type material, and patch over that and try to solve the leak on this one. The other side also has a leak, but it is super slow. It's just one drip. I don't know, I've had 2 drips come out so far, so in a few minutes. So it's very slow, but it's right here in the center, maybe where I started and stopped a weld or something, but I'll see if I can also fix that. That one should be pretty easy to stop. I don't see any leaks anywhere else. The crossover tube is completely dry. I've just got some cheap clamps holding it on. I'll have some really nice wide clamps eventually. But I'm going to take this back apart, dump the water out, and see if I can weld up these spots. I may do one more water leak test, and when I'm happy with that, once the caps are welded on and everything's completely closed, I'll do a pressure test with balloons and let it set for 2 or 3 days and make sure the balloons don't leak down. But that's my plan, and we'll take these back apart and try to patch these leaks. Well, I drained the water out of both tanks, and I've got them laying up here to try to find the leak. And they're pretty easy to spot. If you look where this tape is pointing to here, you can see a little tiny pinhole in between the welds, possibly where I moved over to the side a little too far on that one weld, or maybe where I started and stopped a weld. But little tiny pinhole, that's why the leak was so slow, and that should be pretty easy to weld. And I actually thought this one was up here where I fixed, where I almost burned through, but that's not where it's leaking. It is leaking here. You can see a little tiny divot here underneath the edge of the weld, and that is where the leak is. So that also should be pretty easy to fix. So that is the next thing I'm going to do. I'm going to try to stop those 2 leaks, and I will leak test again with water. Once I'm happy that it's not leaking any water, then I'll finish the tanks and go ahead and weld them up tight, and we'll do our air test. The fuel sending unit came today, and this is what it looks like. Has a float, goes up and down, operates some reed switches inside, and we'll mount in this tank. You can see it doesn't quite come to the bottom. Once it says empty, it'll give you, I don't know, maybe a gallon or 2 reserve fuel. So when the gauge says empty, it's not actually empty. And we're going to mount that. I've got this tank set up. I patched the 2 leaks in the tank last night. I'm going to fill them back full of water again tonight and test and make sure that I have them sealed off good. And if I can find a container, a 1 gallon or a 5 gallon container, I'm going to check and see how much fuel these tanks will actually hold. I'm guessing it's between 15 and 16 gallons, but I'd like to verify that. This sending unit was supposed to come with a gasket and mounting hardware, and it did not. So I've got to figure out exactly what I'm going to use and go ahead and put the holes and this aluminum piece to mount it and figure out exactly how I'm going to do that. So let's get started doing the sending unit, and then we will fill these tanks up and leak check them again. Well, I have the hose for the fuel sending unit, and everything lines up and looks good. What I'm going to do is put some PIM nuts, which is a press-in nut insert. They'll go in from underneath and they'll press in this hole. Takes a pneumatic machine to force them in the hole, but they cinch pretty tight into metal, and then the fasteners will come down through the top, through the fuel sender, and down into those nuts and cinch up tight. I don't have the rubber I need to make a gasket, so I'll have to do that later. But I'll take this part to work with me tomorrow and put the PIM nuts in the bottom side of it and have it ready. And it'll be ready to mount just as soon as I find rubber to make a gasket out of. And I have the fuel tank sitting here connected and completely full of water up to within an inch of the top. And I don't see any water leaking out. I think I cured both of those pinholes that I had in the tanks. But I will let this sit here overnight and just to make sure that it's not leaking anywhere. And then, like I said before, when I get the tops welded on these, we'll do an air leak test, sealing off the openings and put a balloon on it. We'll inflate the balloon and put it over the last opening and let that sit for 2 or 3 days just to make sure that the air doesn't leak out. That's a good test to check for leaks on fuel tanks. But happy with the fuel tank so far, and we'll keep going. Well, I have a pile of wiffle balls, and planning on putting these in one side of the fuel tank, or one half of the fuel tank. And before I do it for sure, I'm going to soak one in gasoline just to make sure it doesn't dissolve, although the material that they're made out of is definitely fuel proof, but I want to confirm that they are made from what they're supposed to be. And I want to see how many of these wiffle balls I can fit in this half of the tank, and try to figure out a game plan to how I'm going to insert them with the fuel pump and make sure the fuel pump reaches the bottom of the tank and seats correctly. But I'm still waiting on one part of the fuel pump before I can finish it, and that's probably going to slow me down a little bit here in the next few days. But I think I can go ahead and cap off the other half of the fuel tank. I made a gasket out of a material that I've got to test. It's just hanging on there. And I put the PIM nuts on the bottom side of this at work today. And they actually press in with a machine on the bottom side. And I'm going to glue them also around the outside perimeter just as a secondary precaution. And once I get that done, this cap can be welded on the other tank half, and that tank half will be finished, short of inserting the fuel sending unit here. But let's see how these wiffle balls go in this half of the tank and how many we can put in there and what it looks like. I have one of the tanks bolted in temporarily. I wanted to show you what I'm using to fasten it in place. You can see down here at the bottom, there is rubber underneath the bottom between the tank and both tubes. There is rubber between the side of the tank and the frame of the car. And there is rubber between the top back of the tank and the frame of the car. And the tank is completely suspended in rubber and bolted to the frame, and with 2 bolts here at the top. These 2 bolts here at the bottom. These bolts are temporary. I'll get some good quality grade 8 fasteners for this, but the 4 fasteners hold the tank in, completely suspended in rubber, and that rubber will probably be glued to the tank and not the car frame. Use some kind of contact cement or something just to hold it in place till it's bolted in securely, and then once it's bolted in, the rubber is sandwiched everywhere and held in place. But pretty happy with this. I don't see there being any issues. I leak tested this tank and with the balloons, and it leaked down. It took about 5 or 6 hours, so it's a tiny leak. It could be one of 3 things. It could be, I've still got one of the balloons on here, pulled across and a zip tie around it. It could be leaking there, or I had a balloon here. It's possible it was leaking here. The balloon just wasn't stretched tight enough around the fitting. I had some packaging tape over these holes. It's possible it was leaking there, or it could still be a leak somewhere in the tank, a really slow leak. I wasn't getting any drips of water out of it, but still may have a leak in the tank itself. But what I'll do is I'm going to pressure test this again with the balloons, and I'm going to put some soapy water around all the fittings and all the glue joints on the tank and see if I can find where it's leaking. But it is a super slow leak. It took several hours to leak down the balloon, and the balloon was small to begin with. So I will continue and try to find that leak and get it stopped, but we're really close on finishing this one tank.